There's nothing I love more than authenticity, which is why I'm so excited about Salsa de la Vida hot sauce, which has been on kitchen tables in Mexico since 1956. It will be available here in the U.S. for purchase later this year. In addition to livening up your food, it's Mexican-owned, it's woman-owned, and it's one of the only hot sauce brands to have 100% Mexican-sourced pepper mix. Salsa de la Vida hot sauce will be available here in the United States to purchase on shelves later this year. Hey there, I'm Lezli Levine-Harvell. Welcome to Impolite Conversation, the podcast, curated by the Iconoclast Dinner Experience. I believe the best way to explore a topic in depth is to view it through multiple lenses. Join us as we explore race, culture, and societal issues through the lens of industry experts, writers, cultural critics, and HBCU students. Today is our second installment of our series, Colonialism, but Make It Sexy. We're exploring the romanticizing of colonialism in popular culture. Last Monday, we chatted with British-based psychologist Caitlin Folks, who specializes in nostalgia. She conducted one of the first pieces of empirical research on historical nostalgia and developed the first index to measure personality traits associated with historical nostalgia. If you haven't listened to it as of yet, seriously, go back and listen because it provides a good framework for the discussion we're going to have today and over the next few episodes. Today, we're going to chat about mint juleps and other such nonsense. That's right, folks. We're going to chat about the myth of Southern hospitality. We're going to explore this with Anthony Szczesiul. He's a professor of English at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, where he teaches American literature, poetry, and Southern literary and cultural studies. He is the author of The Southern Hospitality Myth, Ethics, Politics, Race, and American Memory. Hi, Tony. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor.
So, Tony, I have to say something. I want to begin this conversation by saying there is nothing like a white person calling out other white people in whiteness. It is a sight to behold. So last week, we started out the episode with a description of a plantation tour in Nashville. And it was described with such reverence and grandeur. And this is a current tour. This isn't something I found from like an old brochure. And we know there are industries that are predicated in this narrative of elegance and refinement and etiquette that is supposed to be germane to the South. Your book truly does a deep dive into the roots and etiology of why Southern hospitality is integral to the cultural memory of the United States and the distinct identity of white Americans in both the North and in the South. And I don't think many people realize, myself included, that Southern hospitality as a Southern quote unquote virtue, I'm using air quotes here, was as popular to Southerners as it was to other white people in other regions of the United States. You argue that Southern hospitality actually has nothing to do with the South. Can you talk about this?
Yeah, I guess rather than saying nothing to do with the South, it goes beyond the South. It obviously helps us to define the South of the imagination, but it really, rather than looking at it as regional traits and characteristics, it's a fundamental form of cultural memory in America. And in that way, it's an exclusionary white mythology for most of its history, from its inception in the early 1800s up through the Civil Rights Movement. And it isn't until really the latter parts of the 20th century where African Americans in the South begin to claim Southern hospitality as a regional identifier as well. Before that, during segregation, Southerner would not have meant African Americans living in the South. Southerner was taken to identify white Southerners. When I started reading, the historical explanations of it, I found there was a real gap, that the historians who studied the antebellum South and the social rituals and domestic practices that came to be associated with Southern hospitality, that they stopped and basically admitted that it became a myth as early as 1800, that this went back to the 1600s, but that a lot of the customs had really gone out of fashion.
It was more about American identity.
Mm-hmm. American white identity, yeah. Hospitality is all about fundamentally who belongs and who doesn't. In the American myth of Southern hospitality, it was very much about relationships, imagined relationships between white Northerners and white Southerners in the antebellum period. And it was something that was appealing to many white Northerners for a variety of reasons. Most commonly, I think, race, but also class issues as well. Yeah.
When you say it was popular to whites in the North because of class issues, can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. In the antebellum period, I think it's hard for us to imagine what hospitality meant in the 19th century. And hospitality is a virtue that goes back thousands of years. It's kind of an essential building blocks of societies. And the 19th century was this period where there began to be a separation between hospitality as a moral imperative and as a social ritual. And then we have commodification of hospitality, travel and tourism, products you can buy, identities you can assume. And in the 19th century, the discourse around hospitality in America was being pulled in very different directions. On the one hand, there was a strong religious tradition, the Christian tradition of looking at hospitality as a sort of moral imperative. And there's numerous biblical passages that were often cited. On the other hand, if you think of 19th century social rituals and practices of entertaining, the rites of hospitality were an essential kind of lubricant in social intercourse and among the middle and upper classes. Now, the other side of that is some Americans, if you read 19th century etiquette books, you have some that get to be a little bit anxious about the notion of manners because they feel we're this new country. We broke away from all these old aristocracies, so we need a different type of manners. We need a Republican form of manners and hospitality that's not elitist and aristocratic. But in the 19th century, as you have waves of immigration, you have upward social mobility, people want to hold on to their place. Southern hospitality became popular because it was aristocratic. It appealed to essentially the anti-democratic principles that many people felt, where they wanted to be exclusive rather than egalitarian and welcoming.
That's very interesting. So we did a series maybe about a month ago that explored who gets to be an American or who gets to be American. And we explored that over a few episodes. The second episode in that series, we chat with Dr. Nyambi Carter and Dr. Locke Swee about immigration after the Hart-Celler Act of 1965, which gets rid of quotas and essentially democratizes immigration. And then what happens is, in the US, you get a wave of immigrants of color. Also, in the backdrop of that, you have civil rights legislation being passed. And all of these pesky folks of color who were intended to be the permanent underclass articulating their demands on the state. And you know what else you see at that exact time?
What?
The birth of the Asian model minority myth.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so you and I both know it was a way of trying to use Asians and culture as a continuum of white supremacy and essentially as a propaganda tool to support this notion that racism was somehow in everyone's imagination. And I think that's pretty fascinating. Similarly, I thought it was interesting in your book, you point out the first time we see the term Southern hospitality appear in the literature. Can you share the time period and political discourse that was taking place when we first see the term Southern hospitality make its debut?
Yeah, it's something that was really, kind of a moment of revelation for me, that when I was reading all of the early accounts of Southern hospitality, I never saw the phrase Southern hospitality. Instead, in the 1700s, if people were writing, say, travel narratives, they would talk about Georgian hospitality or Virginia hospitality or Carolinian hospitality. It was localized. It wasn't talked about as a sort of regional characteristic of all the people. And the earliest use of the phrase Southern hospitality that I found in reference to the South in America is in the 1820s, about 1824 or 1826, I believe is the date. And it's important to think of what's going on in the country at the time. It's the beginning of sectionalism in America, where the crisis over slavery causes the South to adopt a sort of siege mentality, where they're all in this together against the rest of the Union. And so you have the South really being called the South for the first time as a collective in the early first decade of the 19th century. And it's not until the mid-1920s that the discourse of Southern hospitality as such, as is recognized by us today, emerges. And it emerges very specifically in debates about slavery. And it becomes a sort of shorthand for understanding all these positive associations with the South: gentility, refinement, manners, graciousness. And all these things are really aspirational for Americans of the middle class.
Irrespective of where you're from.
Irrespective of where you're from, yes. And in a lot of the literature, they make direct appeals to Northerners in whether it's literature, whether it's essays, fiction. They're really appealing to a certain class of Northerners. Although, obviously, middle and lower middle classes are also aspiring to enter those classes. But they really do target this notion of gentility and refinement, and also a sort of cultural capital that sharing this domestic space of the home, but by extension, the nation, that we are one people. And these other people here, the African slaves, are foreigners. They cannot be assimilated. They never will be. As Sarah Josepha Hale describes them, Sarah Josepha Hale is the founder of Thanksgiving in America. And she described the slaves as the stranger within the gates that had no home here. And that was in the preface to an 1850 novel on immigration to Liberia for slaves.
That's pretty interesting. So the term Southern hospitality, this virtue, this term that America has co-signed to as being this defining trait of a large portion of the United States. We have magazines, we have tourism, we have all of these cultural components of present day culture based on a term that was essentially a propaganda tool in defense of slavery.
Yes. Yeah. It very much was used for propaganda. And this is something that just outraged abolitionists. I think one of the things that's interesting is that in the antebellum period, this notion of Southern hospitality was routinely challenged and resisted by opponents of slavery and abolitionists. Yet after the Civil War, after the culture that generated the myth became defunct, the term and the phrase and the mythology and the fiction just proliferated. It became utterly detached and became sort of a free-floating, nostalgic idea that everybody could project onto it all their desires. So it became almost more potent after that culture died away.
More impolite conversation in just a moment. The new HBO documentary Yusef, Hawkins, Storm Over Brooklyn tells the story of Yusef Hawkins, a black teenager who was murdered in 1989 by a group of young white men in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. His death and the official response to it sparked outrage in New York. The film, directed by Muta Ali Muhammad, explores the 30-year legacy of Yusef's murder, and his family and friends reflect on the tragedy and the subsequent fight for justice that inspired and divided New York City. Stream it now on HBO Max. Visit hbomax.com to sign up for your 7-day free trial. You mentioned when people, they come from the North, they visit the South, they experience all this lavishness on these plantations, which are obviously being made possible by enslaved Black people who are sometimes seen, oftentimes unseen. And you also bring up that Thomas Jefferson's estate, Monticello, had an extensive system of dumbwaiters. So his guests never had to see the enslaved people who are making all of this lavishness possible. So I would imagine that you have white Northerners, not all, right? Because you said they were abolitionists, but white Northerners going back up to the North. Oh my goodness, I had such a great time at this opulent estate of such and such. And I can't even begin to imagine the level of quote unquote hospitality that these Northern guests were receiving. And that was being made possible by people who not only feared for their lives, but weren't even being seen as people. Folks in the non-slave holding states knew what was going on. How does the term Southern hospitality get detached from the question of ethics?
You know, one of the things, that's exactly what the abolitionists always tried to put in the spotlight was ethics. As opposed to, as I was mentioning a minute ago, hospitality for Americans in the 19th century existed in kind of these intersecting realms with religion, with social ritual, and increasingly with consumerism and ideas of sort of conspicuous consumption and display and a desire for almost aristocratic sensibilities in the marketplace. So people were being pulled in a variety of directions, but the abolitionists, they were always speaking against Southern hospitality as essentially being fraudulent. They did not deny that Southerners were gracious hosts, but they always reminded the readers, as one writer put it at the time, people feel honored to be the guests of a Southern plantation owner. They should feel as much honor if a highwayman shared the spoils of robbery with you, that this is all based on slave labor. And there's a constant reminder of the labor and the toiling that goes on behind the scenes. That Jefferson at Monticello, I think that's a perfect metaphor for how the Southern hospitality myth has functioned. It's become this myth of white, generous, benevolent identity and graciousness and refinement, but hidden behind it is Black labor. The abolitionists kept trying to put the focus on the unethical and immoral practices of slavery. But many Americans obviously chose to believe in Southern hospitality. And in fact, it became something of a routine dilemma and crisis in the abolitionist community when former abolitionists, and there were cases of this, would travel south and come back and would be essentially converted to a pro-slavery position, saying that I misunderstood this. It wasn't until I was able to go and live among the Southerners and see how benevolent they were to their slaves and how happy the slaves were that now I realized the error of my ways. So it was an effective tool. And one of the ways that it was effective is through publication, through travel narratives. Hospitality is a form of gift exchange. And in gift exchanges, they create a sense of obligation. If a host gives you something, there's a desire to repay the host in some kind. So many of these travelers, the way they did it is they went back to the North and they wrote positive accounts of Southerners and of the benevolent institution of slavery. The ethics were right there front and center in the antebellum period. And in fact, the abolitionists came up with their own discourse where, essentially a form of abolition hospitality. They looked at, for example, taking in fugitive slaves as a form of true Christian hospitality, and Southern hospitality as a form of robbery. So the ethics were always there. And I think sometimes historians would dismiss these claims by abolitionists as basically just a part of the propaganda wars about slavery.
Fake news.
But unlike the kind of debates over the violence of slavery and to the degree to which it exists or the degree to which it's an anomaly, both sides in this agree on, yes, Southerners put on a great show of hospitality. But from our view, from a Christian perspective, you can't call it hospitality. And even a prominent Southerner by the name of Lucian Minor, he did a series of travel letters from his travels in New England in the 1830s and the early 1830s. And he wrote about Yankee hospitality. And he said it's more authentic than Southern hospitality. And his whole point was, if a Northerner invites you into his home, makes a meal, serves food, he's chopped the wood, he's gone out and raised the food, his wife in the 19th century would have made the meals. And as he concludes, he says, hospitality for us, it's a cheap and easy virtue, which is basically acknowledging that there's really not an ethical realm to it.
So to your point, there is a obvious paradox of this narrative of Southern hospitality, and implicit in that, it's defining who belongs and who doesn't. And we know in this very same South, there were sundown towns that had signs that said, "Nigger don't get caught here after sundown." And the Negro Motorist Green Book, or what is commonly known today as the Green Book, which was first published in 1936, because Black travelers couldn't just roll up to any hotel. We know that this hospitality, if it truly did exist, only extended to certain white people, or extended to white people. It certainly wasn't extended to Black people. And so The myth of Southern hospitality is about linking America's past to its present. And so I want to move to present day and cultural representations. So last week I chatted with Caitlin Folks. She specializes in nostalgia, which is an emotion. She conducted a study of and created an index for historical nostalgia. One of the goals of her study was to understand the psychological profile of someone who would be more prone to experiencing historical nostalgia. And just to differentiate for you between personal nostalgia and historical nostalgia, personal nostalgia is longing to go back to something that I personally did or that you personally did, right? It's something that you personally experienced. So like smells and music, she said, are actually pretty common triggers. And she said it's generally a positive emotion. And then versus historical nostalgia, which is longing to go back to a time that you didn't personally experience yourself. And so she said questions that she asked were things like, do you sometimes feel like you were born in the wrong generation? Or do you prefer your parents' music to contemporary music? And she obviously had a number of questions. Those were just a couple. But she found that the profile of someone that is more likely to experience historical nostalgia is less open and less agreeable, but they also have a very high appreciation for beauty and excellence. I think that was like a pretty interesting finding. And I think in many ways makes sense. So we can't have a conversation about the Southern hospitality myth and plantation weddings and Southern charm and all of these virtues that are associated with the myth without talking about the 1939 film, Gone with the Wind, that was based off of the 1936 book of the same name by Margaret Mitchell. There is a 2016 article published by The Guardian entitled Books to Give You Hope. The author, Holly Watts, says, in my family, Gone with the Wind is handed down from mother to daughter in the way other families pass down heirlooms. It is our survival guide. My mother tackles most problems with what would Scarlett do mindset. And even if the answer is rip down the curtains, knock together a dress, and get the hell on with it, that'll be what she does. Scarlett wouldn't bat an eyelash at anything from bad hair to bullying bosses. She would just calculate the best possible next move and go for it. So I don't know what her lineage is, if her mother is American, but this writer is actually a white British woman. So the idea that these white people in another country are passing down Gone with the Wind from mother to daughter like a family heirloom is pretty powerful. According to several sources, if you adjust for inflation, Gone with the Wind is the highest grossing film in American history. And however you feel about it, it is an American cultural artifact. Anthony, based on your research and how Americans feel about Southern hospitality today as a virtue, do you see this mythology waning slowly over time, or do you see this as a permanent part of the American cultural memory?
Wow, that's so much to think about what you went through. And that example of passing down Gone with the Wind from one generation to the next is incredible. I think given the way nostalgia works, I think people become more nostalgic when they have a greater sense of dissatisfaction with the present moment. They're more inclined to. And in fact, this sense of nostalgia is exactly what I think breathed new life into the Southern hospitality myth after the Civil War and during Reconstruction. The old Southern order, all of these images and the lifestyle and the cultural norms and institutions of the South were destroyed. Yet Southern hospitality was able to fill a need, not just to Southerners, but to Americans, that in this emerging, more industrial, more connected, faster-paced world and faster-paced economy, people longed for a simpler time, a time of manners, a time of more discreet social interactions rather than anonymity. And so people could hang their hats on these images of the Old South. And a lot of writers cashed in on that. And Southern hospitality became fodder for advertising as well in the late 19th century and early 20th century. So yes, I think so long as we have nostalgia, this will be a major avenue for Americans to experience nostalgia. And I think the example of plantation weddings is a good one. And I think people are becoming more aware of that nowadays. I think there's more pushback on that. But I've taught a couple of Southern studies classes that focused on the plantation, the image of the plantation in American culture. And my students in their research looking into this notion of plantation weddings found these advertisements for plantation weddings that had pictures of the bridesmaids and brides all hanging out of windows of slaves' cabins on a plantation. And they were all white. That raises a lot of problems, obviously, just ethically speaking, and how we remember the past. And I think part of the problems with historical memory and cultural memory, in order to remember things, we have to forget things. And in order to create a certain narrative that we want that may reflect well on us, we repress things or suppress things that don't reflect well on us. And I think our country's at a reckoning right now around things like the Civil War monuments that we have so much debate around now. One of the things I realize is that Southern hospitality itself is a form of cultural memory, but it's not just a monument. It is a whole system of beliefs about the relationship of the Old South to the present South that wants to create this sense of continuity of culture. You mentioned handing down Gone with the Wind from one generation to another. This does happen a lot in the South with something like Southern Living magazine, that Southern Living magazine was created in one of the worst points of the civil rights movement.
Oh, when was it created?
1963, 1964 in Birmingham, Alabama. You think of the Birmingham church bombing.
That is a good segue to my next question.
Okay.
Caitlin mentioned that you see people experiencing historical nostalgia around times of cultural anxiety. So, for example, you see a lot of nativist sentiment around immigration at the same time as you have Black Lives Matter happening. I'm curious, based on your research, during times of cultural anxiety in the United States, did you see an uptick in the use of the phrase Southern hospitality? I know you brought up Southern living was created during the Civil Rights Movement.
Yeah. The people who were involved in creating Southern Living magazine, that was the pitch. As one of them said in a memoir, he said, everybody was running down the South because of civil rights and because of the violence against African Americans who wanted to vote. And so they wanted a positive image to sell to Southerners to make them feel good about themselves. It was a self-conscious effort to avoid the ugly truths of segregation and to sublimate them and to emphasize these typical notions of Southern
Jim
manners.
Crow, what was happening?
Yeah. And you also mentioned before, I think the Green Book is just an example that this Southern Living is a magazine that was directed to Southerners. But
to white Southerners,
yes,
right?
To white Southerners. Yes, to white Southerners. And the Green Book that you mentioned a minute ago, for African Americans, is like their version of a AAA book to know where they could stop without fear of harassment and where they would be able to get a hotel, what gas station would serve them, where they could have a bathroom stop. Things that just any white American at the time would take for granted. But while Southern Living magazine was directed towards white Southerners, Southern tourism was directed to all white Americans, and all white Americans bought into it. People traveled from across the country to the South. The decades when the civil rights struggles were at their worst was the decades of the South's tourism boom. It's when tourism went on to become the first or second revenue generator in nearly every Southern state over agriculture. So Americans were willing to reconcile in their mind the knowledge that segregation exists, the knowledge that segregation is violence, the images on TV of water cannons and guard dogs and attacking protesters, peaceful protesters. And yet the newspapers and magazines were filled with usages of the term Southern hospitality to sell tourism and to sell economic development as well. Southern hospitality is linked to right-to-work states. We don't have unions here. We're welcoming to business. So it's an incredibly adaptable discourse. I think one of the things when you look at it from the long arc of it, going back to when this developed in the 1820s and 30s, as a way of, in a sense, branding Southern identity in a certain way, it created a form of cultural capital for white Southerners that they have been cashing in on for generations, adapting it to meet different needs at different moments. When you had talked about immigration, a couple of anecdotes from the 19th century, you talked about where you see upticks in this usage. in the early 1850s, there was a series of controversies and debates around the issue of hospitality. And all of it intersected with slavery. First came the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, which essentially made it illegal for Northerners to practice hospitality according to their Christian principles, that if you aided or abetted a fugitive slave, you were subject to fines and imprisonment. So this is the thing that really galvanized the abolitionist movement in the 1850s and made it more of a mainstream organization and political force. The other thing, though, was I think really ties in today with immigration is there were a series of laws across all the southern coastal states, collectively referred to as the Negro Sailor Laws or Negro Seaman Acts. And basically, it was routine for any sailor of color who came into a southern port to be imprisoned for the duration of that ship's time in the port. And if the ship's captain refused to pay the cost of housing, the sailor could be sold into slavery. And this happened to thousands of free men of color, not only Americans, but foreign citizens. And this is something that the abolitionists were railing against in those decades. And especially after the Civil War, the question of ethics, the question of how does hospitality relate to immigration? It seems pretty important, but you look at Alabama's immigration law from many years ago, and it was essentially like the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, that it was illegal to give aid to an illegal immigrant. It outlawed hospitality. And this is where it caused problems with some Christians in Alabama. They couldn't accept that. Not all Christians, but some. So there is this ethical realm that's always there when we think about hospitality. The French philosopher Jacques Derrida, who really influenced my thinking on this early in my study of the issue, but he says that true hospitality is an acceptance of risk. If I know that the person I'm letting in is going to be beneficial to me, if they're going to reinforce my own identity and there's going to be some use to be had out of them, it's not hospitality. When I open my doors, I have to be willing to take a risk. For Derrida, and also for somebody like Immanuel Kant, hospitality is an ethical imperative, an ethical ideal that we always strive to, but can never really live up to. But it's worth the striving, rather than just marketing hospitality as tourism.
Tony, this has been such an interesting conversation. Thank you for studying the historical roots of this myth. Your research and your book is so significant. It really provides a deep understanding of the racial underpinnings and ideology of a phrase that's thrown around so lightly. And really, it's a lens through which we should be viewing the phrase Southern hospitality, because you really cannot separate that phrase from enslaved people and the defense of slavery. So this is my last question, and it's a fun one. As you know, the podcast is curated by the Iconoclast Dinner Experience. It's your last night on Earth. Where are you eating?
Oh, boy. My last night on Earth, where am I eating? Unfortunately, the place that I would have picked a while ago has just closed. There was a Polish restaurant in Brooklyn called Teresa's, and it was very much a kind of a neighborhood institution. I just took my daughter down there. She's starting college in Brooklyn, and unfortunately, we saw that it had closed recently. Thankfully, it didn't close because of the pandemic, but the owners who ran it for something like 30 years, they just decided they were tired of it, and they retired. But it was real comfort food, and it also made me nostalgic because getting good pierogi as someone who grew up in a Polish neighborhood in Detroit and had a lot of homemade pierogi over the years and potato pancakes and things. So that would have been it. Now it's hard for me to say.
So you mentioned pierogies and potato pancakes. What is comfort food for you?
I often have very strong memories associated with Velveeta cheese, right? Which is, my mom made grilled cheese sandwiches for us and as kids. And I tell you the truth, I'm a lover of good cheese. Cheese and bread, I could eat that and be happy.
Thank you for listening to Impolite Conversation, the podcast, curated by the Iconoclast Dinner Experience. You can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Icon Dinner and on the Iconoclast Dinner Experience Facebook page. Let us know what you thought about this episode. Hit us on socials or send us feedback at press@iconoclastdinner.com. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to our podcast, and we'd also love it if you rated and reviewed us.